Well, good morning. Looks like I got the volume setting right on this one. This is good. Welcome everybody again to our fourth installment on the Gospel of Leviticus. Hopefully you're having as much fun as I am. I really enjoy teaching Leviticus. I think it's a fun book. We get to talk about barbecue. We get to talk about food. We get to talk about sex and pus. All those things that, you know, as physicians, we're really excited about. So again, welcome. If this is your first time to Temple Bible Church, we're glad to have you. If this is your first time here, I can tell you that the average age of Temple Bible Church is a little bit lower than this. But we're glad to have you. David Jennings is here to sell you insurance if you need it. By the way, I am on call, so if my phone goes off, I gave David the choice of either handling my calls or handling Leviticus, and he'd rather handle bleeding patients. So, because he figures at least he can ask them if they have insurance. So that could happen. And again, welcome as we continue this. For those of you who have asked, there is a YouTube channel for this. We try to send out a link. I think Kathy has sent out a link. If you can't, you can just go on YouTube and search Temple Bible Church, Leviticus, or TBC Leviticus, or TBC Bob, whatever. You can find me on YouTube. It's not that hard to find if you don't get the link. So that's about that. And then again, I do want to open up just to see if anybody has any questions, because we have been talking about some issues. I do get some questions afterwards. If you have any questions or comments, things that you may have read about, you know, how do we interpret Leviticus? When we talked about the interpretation of Leviticus, if you want to talk about, you know, our role or questions about our role as sacrifice, you know, how do we as Christians today fulfill and obey the Levitical sacrifices? Or how do we obey the Levitical teachings on the priesthood as a royal priesthood? If anyone has any questions about that or anything else about Leviticus, now's the time to ask. Any questions? Okay. I don't think that's because you have no questions. But that's okay. I will respect your silence for one more week. And then after that, we'll start talking. Okay. Well, then let's look at this week. We're going to look at Leviticus chapters 11 through 12. And I guess I want to start off with, there we go. What food would you not eat? Sweet potatoes? Now, why not sweet potatoes? That's not what I would have expected. Ah. So you felt deceived by your older brothers. That here they are supposed to be candied potatoes, and they're not candied potatoes, and that just kind of put you off.
You haven't tasted mine.
So next week we will definitely have some candied potatoes in here. Other foods that you would not eat.
Locusts.
Locusts.
Organ meat.
Organ meat. So you wouldn't eat liver.
I choke on it.
Really? How about liverwurst?
No, not interested in that either.
Okay. Raisins. Now tell me about raisins. Just okay. Other foods you would not eat. Okra. In our house, we call it yuckra. Yeah, I think my battery went dead again. We'll try this. So I heard okra, and in our house, we call it yuckra. Yuckra. Because it's just kind of slimy. Other foods.
Right, you like it.
You fry anything, you'll like it. You can fry sweet potatoes, fried liver, probably going to be okay. And I'm sure there's someone in Louisiana who's fried it. Other things you might not eat. Well, as I was thinking about this, monkey brains came to mind. Not interested in monkey brains. And I don't, it'd be one of those things that even if I were at a location where it was considered a delicacy, and if by not eating them I would offend them, sorry, I'm going to offend you. I'll apologize for offending you, but just not interested in monkey brains. Well, the reason I bring this up is because when we talk about the kosher laws, and again, we're familiar with kosher laws one way or the other, it's a list of things that the Jews were not allowed to eat. So if you were to ask a practicing Jew today, they would give you a very long list of foods that they would not eat. So we're going to look today as to why they would not eat them. Where does that come from? Why does God take time out of his busy schedule to basically give you a menu of things that you can eat and things that you should not eat? Now, again, as we've said from the very beginning, in order to understand Leviticus, we need to understand the context. So, if we're going to understand again the prohibition against bacon cheeseburgers, which would be very, very unkosher, we need to remember that Leviticus is written to a people who are already in a covenant relationship with God. So again, these kosher laws are not written in order to get you saved or to become Jewish. This is how you behave because you're already in a covenant relationship with God. You are already God's covenant people. And these are people who are currently in the desert. Okay? They are on their way from Egypt to the promised land. They are currently in the desert. They are coming from a culture. They are going to a culture, and they've got a lot of things to learn about how to be a nation. So that is the context of Leviticus. And then the second aspect is to remember that Jesus himself says he did not come to abolish the law but to fulfill the law. And that includes Leviticus. So one of the things that we're going to do is once we understand the Levitical laws in context, we're going to ask ourselves, how did Jesus fulfill this law? Because once we understand how Jesus fulfilled the law, then we as the body of Christ can understand how we fulfill the law, how Leviticus should guide our living today. So that's why we're doing all of this. Any comments or questions to this point? Okay. Can you guys still hear me in the back without the microphone? Great. So we are now looking at a section of Leviticus called the purity laws. The first two sections were sacrifices and priests, and that was a major section. Testing, good, I don't have to shout. We are now coming to the next few chapters, 11 through 15, are called the purity chapters. And these chapters are all teaching about clean versus unclean. They are giving the nation of Israel a lesson on what it means to be pure as God's covenant people. Chapter 11 is going to talk about food. Chapter 12 is going to talk about women in their childbearing function. 13 and 14 are going to talk about communicable diseases, both on a person and in your home. And then chapter 15 is going to talk about cleaning. And what do you do when you have bodily discharges? Again, we're going to see God does have a purpose for all those. But for the next many chapters, which for us is 2 weeks, all of these lessons, all of these teachings are about purity, cleanness. So, in order to understand what this is about, because this can be one of those areas, wait a minute, why in the world does God say that a woman who has given birth is unclean for 33 days unless she has a male son, in which case, a female daughter, in which case she's unclean 66 days. Okay, that makes no sense. I'll be the first one to agree with you. You read chapter 12 and you're thinking, wait a minute, why is a woman unclean when she gives birth? That's not a sin. And then why would it be that a male infant and a female infant are different levels of uncleanness for the mom? Great question. Doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Okay, but if Jesus and they came to fulfill the law, then we can trust that there's something in there for us. Now, that's why we need to talk about holiness. Because when you come to chapter 11, and you get the dietary laws, and then they are followed by the dietary and childbearing laws, in the middle of it is this section, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. So one of the things that we recognized when we were talking about Leviticus early on is that we cannot just say that these laws only apply to Israel, because God founds them on his holiness. There's something about the holiness of God. There's something about the name of Yahweh that comes into play here. And God does not change. His holiness does not change. So there's something going on here that we need to understand. And one of the things we need to do is begin to come up with this idea of holy. Now, when we say holy, what comes to mind? What does holy mean? So, set apart.
Free of sin.
Free of sin.
Perfect.
Perfect. Keep going.
Transcendency.
There's a transcendency. Somebody said something?
Pure.
Pure. Okay? You may have heard it described that holy, you can think of as holy other. H-O-L-Y is giving us the idea of W-H-O-L-L-Y, holy other. Now, it's interesting. The Hebrew word for holy is kadosh. And what that means, first of all, kadosh is only referring to God or religious things. So that's the idea of set apart. So when we're dealing with kadosh, we're dealing with about things that have to do with God. And it does. It has this idea of separateness. It's this idea of being completely set apart. So that which is holy is not like anything else. That which is holy is completely separate from imperfection, is completely separate from sin. Because when you think about it, what is sin?
The absence of holiness.
So that's a good tautology. So tell me more. What is sin?
It's a violation of God's law.
And then remember, what did we say that the purpose of the law is? To show us the character of God. So sin is all those things that are not in keeping with the character of God. So by definition, holiness and righteousness are the same. Because God is who he is. And so this idea of separateness, of holy other, he is pure, he is righteous, he is complete, he is completely set apart. That's what this idea of holiness is about. Now, how do we know what holiness means? Sam, you can stay if you want to hear this.
I need it, man.
How do we know what holiness means?
God's word.
Okay, great. God's words. And where in God's word does it say holiness? Definition.
So we are to be holy as he is holy. So we know what holiness is because he tells us that that is who he is.
Sure, which would be great.
He gives us the law. He gives us Leviticus to show us how he is separate.
Okay.
He is other.
So if God is going to say, I am holy, that gives us a definition. But again, without anything else, it's a tautology. I am holy. What is holiness? Holiness is that which is in keeping with God. Okay, I've learned nothing. The reason we know what holiness is because God has given us pictures of what holiness is. Same thing with love. What is love? Now, we can define love, but if you go throughout the entire scripture, love is rarely defined. Love is acted out. And so the absolute truth of God is love is given to us by the absolute truth of God's loving actions that we see throughout Scripture. The same thing is true of holiness. Okay? We talked about that. And so one of the things we begin to realize is that holiness is contrasted with unholiness. And there is a divide between the two. It is not a continuum. It is a quantum distinction. Now, give you an example. Again, why does this matter in culture? Well, where did the nation of Israel just come from? Egypt. Where were they going?
Promised land.
Canaan. And who lived in Canaan? Okay, that's why I said Canaan, because you can't say the Promised Landites. Okay? The Canaanites lived there. Now, tell me what you know about Egyptian gods and Canaanite gods.
There were a lot of gods.
There were many of them. They were made in man's likeness, absolutely. Or what else were they made in? Or nature, or animal, or some combination of them. Or from fallen angels, things that have fallen. So from their culture, and remember, Moses and this group of Israelites had not spent much time in the presence of Yahweh. It's been about 2 years since they left Egypt. The plagues of Egypt in that period of time may have been about 2 years. So for about 4 years, people are now interacting with this Yahweh God. Prior to that, nothing. God had been silent since the time of Jacob and Joseph in Egypt. So for 400 years, God's not interacting. There is no Bible for them to read. All they have are stories. They're living in the midst of a culture in which God, G-O-D, they would call Elohim, and that's a similar word to what they have, where God is basically a superman. Take human attributes, build them up to an nth degree, and now you have what a God is. Gods were made in the image of man. So man is smart, God would be super smart. Man is strong, God is super strong. Man, has relation, God has relationship. So their concept of God is Superman. And even the animals that are pictures of God are meant to give them a picture of what this deity would look like. Now, take that idea, and now Yahweh is going to come into person and say, I am Yahweh, your God. And Yahweh as God is totally different than what you are thinking about. I am not a superman. I am totally different than everything you think or know about a deity. You cannot take your experience, extrapolate it, and multiply, and come up with who I am. My nature is radically, completely different than yours, as is my moral character. Okay, you are used to gods in Egypt, and you are going to be going to gods in Canaan, where they commit adultery, where they are unfaithful, they lie, they cheat, they steal. My character is morally blameless. There is no association between me and sin. Quantum difference. And so it is this concept of God. Remember, God, Yahweh, is introducing himself to a people with whom he's not had a relationship with for over 400 years. And so he's going to have to correct what their initial assumptions will be. Their initial assumptions of what a deity is were formed by their Egyptian culture. In the future, it would continue to be assaulted and influenced by the other cultures around them. So Yahweh has to define who he is, and he's going to have to do it in a way that makes it clear. So we saw that last week. God gave them a physical picture of his holiness. Remember, we talked about the idea, God in his holiness dwelling in the tabernacle. His fearsome light at night, the overwhelming cloud by day. The people surrounding that. And remember, we talked about what was clearly obvious was the large space between God and his covenant people. That as people looked at God's dwelling place, one of the things that is immediately apparent is there's a very large space, there's a tent around the outside of it, and there are only very few people who can go back and forth through that space, and those people have been appointed by God, and even those people need sacrifices. So God has given them a physical picture of his holiness and their unholiness. Now God is going to give them some daily representatives to teach them the difference between his holiness and their unholiness. So he's going to start with holy. And we're going to learn what clean is. Now, clean is not holy. There is a separation. There is a distinction between holy and clean. And then there is unclean. Holy, clean, and unclean. Holy is not the same as clean. Clean is not the same as holy. You're either holy or unholy. But within unholiness, there is clean and unclean. Now, that which is holy goes down a level to clean. That process is profane. The idea of profane is to take that which is holy, set apart, and make it common. So when something is profaned, it has gone from holy to clean. And then if something is clean is polluted, it then becomes unclean. Now, one of the things you need to note, unclean is not synonymous with sinful. Sinfulness is unclean, but unclean is not the same as sinful. So, immediately jumping ahead to chapter 12. For a woman to be unclean after childbearing, that doesn't mean that she is sinful. It means that she is unclean. One of the animals that you could not eat is the donkey. What did Jesus ride into Jerusalem on? A donkey. So that which is unclean does not necessarily mean it is sinful. And for the rest of the chapters that we're going to talk about, you need to recognize that in Leviticus, unclean and sin are not the same things. Yes, you have a question?
Me?
Yes.
It's not sin, but it does give us a picture of sin.
Okay, and thank you, everybody. We're done now. Yes, that's exactly what we're getting to.
Yeah.
Uncleanness is going to give us a picture of sin, but it is not the same thing as sin. And understanding that distinction helps us now be able to go to Leviticus and recognize, wait a minute, God is not saying that a woman who just gave birth is somehow sinful. That is not what he is saying. Okay? A person who eats a bacon cheeseburger back in those days, okay, is not necessarily sinful. It is unclean. Now, you can begin to say, if they knowingly know they're not supposed to eat it, and they eat it in defiance of God, now what are they? Now they're sinful, but their sin is not the bacon cheeseburger. The sin is defying God. Now, fortunately, God has other things to teach. These cleansing rituals that we will talk about, washing of hands, okay, burning of things. That is how you move from unclean to clean. So first of all, one of the things that we see is that in the same way, while naturally there is a huge difference between God and man, God provides gracious priests to allow us to have access to God. In the same way, we are not automatically set as unclean, and we are not forever in the unclean state. Through cleansing, we can move from unclean to clean. And through sanctification, we can move from clean to holy. So, those sacrifices that were occurring in chapters 1 through 6, those are the things that set us apart. Remember, talking about being consecrated, set apart, being sanctified. That is how we move from clean to holy. The washing of hands, the washing of pots, the breaking of things. That is how we move from unclean to clean. And this process is set up to show us what sin is and what sin does. It's set up to separate us. It's set up to teach us our separation from God, but it's also set up to separate Israel from all the surrounding nations. Why? Because God set them apart. Deuteronomy, I have chosen you from among all the nations to set you apart. Exodus 19, you are a chosen people, a holy nation. So these laws aren't only teaching them in the physical world, the abstract concepts of holiness, unholiness, righteousness, and unrighteousness. It is also teaching them what it means to be a holy nation, set apart from the world in order to save the world. Are you with me so far? This is really, really, really important to understanding Leviticus as a whole. This spectrum between holy, clean, unclean, and how we get there. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, the other aspect of it is not only the separation, but the relationship with God. That is how they can have a relationship with God. To understand the uncleanness and to have that relationship, they need to be clean. And so
you really have looked at my notes in advance, because now we talk about what are the ramifications of being unclean, other than the fact that you have this unclean on you. It's kind of like the scarlet letter. You go around with the unclean, unclean. Well, there are ramifications for being unclean, and the ramifications are that you are cut off. If you are unclean, you are cut off from the covenant people. You have to be set aside. You cannot participate in the normal activities of God's covenant people. And all you need to do is think about the past 12 to 18 months of how COVID cut us off from one another, and recognize the incredible impact that being cut off can have. Being cut off is not this, it's this minor thing like a slap on the wrist. Well, you know what? If you've had this, you're cut off from your people. It's a big deal. When you are living in a covenant people and you require one another in order to live life, and you are cut off from your people, that's a problem. And that's what uncleanness does. Uncleanness cuts you off from your people. Now, I can't necessarily see myself cut off from God, but I can certainly see myself cut off from other people. I can't necessarily see a transformation that occurs when God forgives me, but I can certainly see dirt and blood wash off my hands when I use water. I can't necessarily see God taking away my sins when I give a sacrifice, but I can certainly see smoke going up that tells me something is going away. So God gives the nation of Israel these various physical, they're a little bit more than symbols, but I'll use that. He gives them these physical symbols in order to teach them the metaphysical reality. Okay, the spiritual aspect of holiness, unholiness, righteousness, unrighteousness, separation from God because of sin, sin leading to death. Those are all very real. But those things are difficult to see in space and time using our senses. So God gives us these physical space-time examples, reminders, symbols to teach us the reality of creation, fall, redemption, and glory. 4 great words, all of them abstract. But now we can begin to see where we were. What does it mean to fall? How far did we fall? What are the results of that fall? Is our fall really that bad? Absolutely. What does redemption look like? How do we go about redemption? Can we redeem ourselves? Do we need someone to redeem and intercede for us? Absolutely. Where do we get to? We get to glory. What is glory? Relationship with God again. And so that is the key aspect of understanding these holiness laws, these purity laws within the book of Leviticus. Are we good? If you get nothing else from the next few weeks from Leviticus, this is what you need to understand. That uncleanness does not necessarily equal sin, but sin is always unclean. Now you can begin to understand and see how Leviticus can begin to make sense. Okay, so let's see how this applies to the dietary laws. How many of you had an opportunity to read chapter 11? Okay, so, and as I said, much of this is familiar to you, whether you recognize it or not, because, the Bible doesn't call them kosher laws, they call it dietary laws. I'm using the word kosher because that's something we're more familiar with. So, if you go through, you will notice that it's divided into 3 sections. There were land animals, mammals, water creatures, and flying creatures. And within that, there were things you could eat and things that you could not. So give me an example of something that you can eat that's an animal. Not a trick question. Cows. Sure. Guys, when in doubt, you can use the pictures. We can use cows. Give me an example of something that you can't eat. Pork. Why? What does pork come from? Pigs. Okay. Can you eat donkeys? Okay. But is a donkey an unclean animal? No. Jesus rode on one. They used camels. Can you eat a camel? No. So eating them is different than using them. This is referring to what you can eat. Okay, water creatures. Okay, you can have something with scales on it.
Fish.
Pretty much any kind of fish. Except, yeah, which is interesting because it's unclear why halibut would be not allowed. And you can't have lobster or shrimp, which is really bad because I like both lobster and shrimp. Not a big fan of oysters. Clam chowder, fine. Okay. And then you've got flying creatures. Now, you can eat a chicken. A chicken can't fly very far, but technically they have wings and feathers. What can you not eat?
Eagles.
Okay, birds of prey. Now, let's take a step back now Why in the world, if God is going to use this idea of holiness, clean and unclean, to teach about being separate, why is he spending so much time talking about food?
It's something we do every day.
Number one, it's something we do every day, usually multiple times a day.
Constant reminder.
It is a constant reminder because it occurs every day. Why else? It goes into your body. It's very personal. Why else would God use food? Think culturally. How do we build relationships? Over meals. Okay, think of how important eating together is to the development of community, to the development of relationship. And the idea of being able to eat certain things and unable to eat other things would be very much a dividing aspect between Israel and all the surrounding people. That if we were going to have fellowship, there were going to have to be some major rules followed. And in following that, if you're not Jewish, it's very clear, wait a minute, I am not a part of this group. We are very different. Now, what's interesting is to see how powerful that is today. Okay, many of you may have gone on the Holy Land pilgrimage with TBC and done all the stuff you're supposed to do. Well, we went, and we have a niece that lives in Jerusalem. And our niece is Jewish, and she is married to an Orthodox Jew, and she herself is studying to be an Orthodox priestess. And so one of the evenings while we were in Jerusalem, we went to visit them, and we said, okay, where do you want to go eat? You know, they don't have a lot of money. He said, we'll take you out somewhere. So they took us to a restaurant, and it was a really nice restaurant. But when you got to the restaurant, there was literally a division. 2 patios. 2 restaurants. And when you were there, the first decision you had to make is, are you going to eat meat or milk? Okay, because Leviticus says you cannot cook meat in the mother's milk. So you can't have milk and meat at the same meal. And so this restaurant, in order to follow the Levitical law, had an immediate division. You would be in 2 different patios while you were waiting. You had 2 different sets of waiters. There were 2 different parts of the restaurant, I found out later, with different air circulation systems, different waiters, different food, different plates. The kitchens were separate. The menus were separate. Everything about this restaurant was separate. You had to make a choice. And once you were in there, you could not change your mind. If you wanted to change your mind, you left. And you went to McDonald's. Okay, that was in 2019 modern day Jerusalem. The idea of food communicating separateness is a very, very powerful tool. Now, the question always comes up, how did God decide what foods to make clean and what foods are unclean? We know why, demonstrate holiness and to teach him about that. But why did he pick some unclean and some clean? What do you think? So there are some that feel that these decisions were made primarily for hygiene. And if you look at that, you can see, yeah, there are some hygiene issues here. Most of the birds that you cannot eat are carrion feeders, so they would get diseases from dead things. And as we see later, dead things pollute you, they make you unclean, and so a bird or something that eats from dead things is unclean, and therefore you shouldn't eat it. That's one aspect of it. Okay? Same with fish. So hygiene is one potential reason. Why else might have God has made this list? there anything else you notice about the clean and unclean?
There's more docile or timid.
The question is, are they more domesticated? And that's more because we've domesticated them over time. You know, needless to say, Jews have been wondering about this for a very long time. And if you read some of the rabbinic traditions that go back to the Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're commentaries on Leviticus. And one of the prevailing opinions is that it was totally at random. Well, no, that it was random, and I'll explain why for a reason. In other words, the Jews of the early, what we would call early New Testament, late Old Testament, like about 100 or 200 BC. They looked at this and said, God chose them at random. Why? Because God chose us at random. God chose us not because of anything in and of ourselves, but because he had a reason and he chose us, and therefore these things are chosen to, again, be able to give us a picture of God choosing us. Boy, I'm not, for people who are actually practicing this, who are closer to the time, I'm not necessarily going to argue with that. You look at hygiene. Absolutely, there are hygiene issues here. Okay? Pork at that time in that culture had a lot of disease with it. Okay? We can see, as we talk about later, this idea of hand washing. And you look at some of the quarantining that occurred with leprosy, and I'm not going to steal any of Stephen's thunder, but there are hygiene aspects to this. But if it's hygiene primarily, then why is it that Jesus comes along and says, okay, now everything is clean and unclean? Everything that was unclean is now clean. Hygiene didn't change. Health laws didn't change. So while hygiene may have been something as a side benefit, I don't know that we can say that hygiene is the primary reason for these. Another thing that you will look at is, again, according to the Jewish mind, and we have to think like ancient Near East Jews, there is that which is normal and abnormal. Those things which are in keeping with the created order and things that are not in keeping with the created order. And one of the things that you will notice is that most of the things that you can eat are quote unquote normal. They're not eating dead things. Remember, death came into being because of the fall. Blood. Okay, the life is in the blood. We know that blood is really important. That's what's going to come up next chapter, in chapter 12, this idea of blood. That's abnormal to have the shedding of blood. So you see that there is a prohibition against eating things that tend to eat blood. Now, from our perspective, I haven't been able to figure out a convincing overarching reason that solves everything. I can appreciate what the Jewish rabbis talked about of symbolism. I think that's clearly a part of it. Part of one of the things that God is going to do is, look, you need to follow me because I am God and you are not. All we have to do is get to the book of Job and recognize God does sometimes things the way he wants to, strictly to show that he is God and we are not. Okay? If these are random choices by God, that's what it means to be holy. I don't have a problem with that. If these are chosen because they reflect the created order and what happens and the difference between creation, fall, and redemption, and somehow these foods are representative of that which is good, normal, holy, the way it's supposed to be in creation, and those that we can't eat aren't, fine. That's teaching creation, fall, redemption, glory. I don't have a problem with that. Reality is we don't know for sure. The good news is we don't have to worry about it too much. Again, you guys know the end of the story. We can eat whatever we want. But it's important for us to, there's the question mark as to why. Now, other things that add into that, we talk later on in the chapter talks about carcasses causing defilement. So here we get into this picture of something that is dead can take something which is clean and make it unclean. So if you are dealing with a carcass and you accidentally run up against it or something, you now become unclean. Carcasses cause defilement. Again, it doesn't make you a sinner. It makes you unclean. There's a distinction. And then creeping creatures are detestable. That kind of goes without saying. That's one where they have to specifically say, it's okay for you to eat locust. Now, I'm not going to. It's okay for you to eat grasshopper. Not interested. And I have seen in stores chocolate-covered crickets. Those are kosher. You can go into certain Jewish delis and get chocolate-covered crickets. Again, not interested. Give me the matzo ball soup. I'm fine. And so you have these dietary laws. And as I said, when you come to chapter 11, you get this idea why. It's because God is telling them who they are. I am Yahweh. Yahweh is God's personal name. I am not a distant deity, unnamed. I am Yahweh. I am holy. You need to learn these things because it is teaching you about who I am and my nature. I am holy, righteous, just. You cannot freely approach me in and of yourselves. In the same way that you see things that are clean and unclean, I am holy, you are not holy. In the same way that there are things that you do that move you from clean to unclean. Sin takes you from a good relationship with me to a separate relationship with me. In the same way that you can go from unclean to clean, I have provided a way that you can go from unholy to holy. So God gives us the interpretation of Leviticus right here in the middle of it. Any other questions about dietary laws? So let's take a look at the next chapter, chapter 12. Basically, it's talking about childbirth. And there are two things about childbirth that are mentioned here. Number one, childbirth made a woman unclean. Why? What made them unclean? The flow of blood. So it's not the giving of birth, it's not sex, it's not being pregnant, it's the issue of blood that makes them unclean. So in related to childbirth, menstruation, which is also a flowing of blood, made a woman unclean. Now, an interesting historical note, if a woman had a male child, they were unclean for how many days?
33.
If she had a female child, how long?
66.
Double.
Actually, the 33, including the 7, would make it 40.
Or the 8, which makes it 41.
40 days. And
So,
the other one would be 70.
why the difference? Again, all kinds of speculation. But one of them is that in the same way that a woman is unclean, well, because she is giving birth to a female, remember we talked about this representation, we talked about sin or unsin being the female child. Well, you really can't cut off a female child as an infant, but we can take that and put it on the woman. And so that the mother is representative of the female infant, and so that's why she is twice as long unclean, because she's not only unclean for herself, she's unclean for her daughter on her daughter's behalf. And again, we've already seen that kind of representative position. They're not the same. I think we can figure that one out. Okay? So, what we have here is a picture, again. Is pregnancy normal?
Yes.
Do most women walk around pregnant? No. Now, again, I am treading very lightly here because I don't want to imply that somehow pregnancy is abnormal, but you get the point. Pregnancy is a special state. It is normal physiologically, it is God-given, it is wonderful, and is God, but most people don't normally walk around pregnant. There's something different about it. God is setting aside and emphasizing that difference. Men don't get pregnant. So the other thing we see in here, there is a very clear distinction between men and women. Again, God is using things that we can see in order to teach us about those things that we cannot see. Remember how Galatians, Paul talks about the law being a tutor. This is elementary tutoring. And uncleanness is not the same as sin. Comments or questions about chapter 12? Now, surprise, surprise, again, we're going to see how Jesus addresses these in some very interesting ways. We talked about it last week. You know, in Mark chapter 7, as Dave Richard was teaching through it, we have this picture, and Jesus basically explains the dietary laws. Okay, remember, Jesus is being questioned by the religious leaders of Jerusalem. Why do you eat with sinners? Why are your disciples not washing their hand? In other words, why aren't they following Leviticus? And remember Jesus' answer. It's not what you eat that makes you unclean, because what you eat goes in your mouth, and the Greek is very graphic about what happens when it comes out the other end. That doesn't defile you. It doesn't go through your heart. It's what's in your heart that defiles you. And Jesus is clearly talking about sin. So Jesus is letting them know, look, this whole idea between clean and unclean was supposed to be giving you a picture between righteousness and unrighteousness. The things in and of themselves were not sinful. It's what they were picturing. And notice what it says in there. And by this, Jesus declared all things what? Clean. So when it comes to clean versus unclean, where do we stand today? Everything is clean. When it comes to sin and righteousness, where do we stand today? Sin remains. Again, you need to recognize the distinction. When Jesus declares that which is unclean, clean, he is not saying that which was sinful is now unsinful. Sin remains sin. Eating a bacon and cheeseburger was not a sin. Deliberately defying God in eating it is a sin. Eating a bacon cheeseburger today would have absolutely no effect. But eating a bacon cheeseburger in defiance of your parents who told you specifically not to is a sin. Because the sin is one of defiance and pride, not eating the wonderful, delicious, juicy, it's getting close to noon, bacon cheeseburger. Now, what's also interesting about that, Mark chapter 7, is, it says, and by this Jesus declared all things clean. Who wrote Mark? Mark. Who was Mark? John Mark, probably a believer. Who was his mentor? Peter. Okay, so Mark is giving you Peter's perspective. Who was the one that had the vision in Acts chapter 10? Peter. you can now begin to see the echo of Peter in Mark chapter 7, because Peter was all about this idea of clean and unclean. If you have, we don't have time now, but you go to Acts chapter 10. We are used to the story. Peter is in Joppa. Okay? Remember why Joppa is important? Who else went to Joppa? Jonah. Now, why did Jonah go to Joppa? To flee from what? Who had God told him to go to? Nineveh. Who were the Ninevites? Gentiles. Okay? Jonah went to Joppa to get away from witnessing to the Gentiles. Peter is in Joppa. He gets a vision. What is the vision? It's this sheet with all these unclean animals on it. And Peter says, God basically says, or the person in the vision says, kill and eat. And Peter says, I've never eaten anything unclean. I followed Leviticus 11 my entire life. Sheet goes away, comes down 3 times. I followed Leviticus. Finally, the third time, he says, look, what I have declared clean, don't call unclean. Who comes to the door? A Gentile. Peter's faced with a choice. Does he obey God and go to the Gentiles, or does he flee? Just like Jonah had a choice. Unlike Jonah, Peter goes to the Gentiles. He goes to Cornelius, and he tells the story, okay, what do you want from me? God told me I was going to go to you. What's it? And they basically say, we want to know this God. We want to know this Jesus. We don't want to be separate. And Peter says, wow, I used to think of you guys as separate, but God is showing me we are the same. I need to break down this law. Sure. Let me share the gospel with you, and we can become one, and we can eat together. Jesus removes that separation between Jew and Gentile. What God was trying to teach them about separation, Jesus now removes. So whereas there was a time that it was important for the Jews to remain separate, now that separation looks different. No longer is that separation going to be based on what you eat or who you can fellowship because of clean or unclean. That wall is gone. And then the woman who had the issue of blood. How long did she have it? And what had she already tried? Yeah, in fact, specifically it says Scott and White physicians. If you go back in there, it says they entered her case into Epic and it didn't help. So, she touches Jesus, and what happens? She's healed. Now, the healing is miraculous, but something even more miraculous occurred. Do you know what it is?
Jesus knew someone touched him.
Well, Jesus knew someone touched him, and what happened to Jesus? He did not become unclean. In every other time in human history, when that which is clean is touched by or touches something unclean, what happens to the clean thing? Every single time, the clean becomes unclean. But the unclean reaches out and touches Jesus. Does he become unclean? No, that is the bigger miracle. Okay? Remember when Jesus told the guy down the roof, take up your bed and walk? Why did he do that? To show that he could forgive sins. The greater miracle was not that a lame guy could walk. The greater miracle is that our sins could be forgiven. The miracle of the woman in the issue of blood, Leviticus chapter 12. This is Leviticus 12 woman. She's healed. Great. Wonderful miracle. Happy for her. The much greater miracle is that God came into the world, and rather than being made unclean, is now making the world holy around him. Jesus becomes profane in order to make others holy. The separation between God and man physically is gone. The separation between God and man culturally. Jesus transcends that boundary in order to take that which is unclean, to take that which is unholy, and make it holy. Jesus' holiness is so great that it cannot be defiled. So, what do we do with this? Well, we are Jesus. One of the things that we can recognize is that, again, go back to Mark chapter 7. Jesus didn't say that sin went away. There were still sins, and he gives you a list of sins. And he tells us don't sin. You know, we can eat what we want, but for the example, gluttony is still sin. Grace looks like something. Grace behaves a certain way, and sin is still sin. We don't have to worry about clean or unclean, but absolutely we are called to live holy lives, which means we are called to not sin. Because our holiness is supposed to be attractive. And so even though we can eat whatever we want, gluttony and other things are still sinful. Secondly, we are still to be demonstrably different from the society that surrounds us. God gave them the purity laws in order to show the entire world that Israel, God's chosen people, are different. We are a holy nation, the church. We are supposed to be demonstrably different than the world around us. People should look at us and see, okay, there's something different. Why? Well, because we believe something different than the world around us. We have a different value system than the world around us. We should act differently than the world around us. So as we conduct ourselves, a legitimate question should be am I doing this to be in conformity with the world around us, or am I doing this to be in conformity of my citizenship, which is in heaven, and therefore I'm going to look different? The methods of church and Christianity are not the world's methods. The values of the church and Christians are not the world's method. So we shouldn't look like the world. We should look, behave, and think very differently. You know, we taught the idea of being in the world and not of the world. So I have the picture of the boat. You know, the boat is in the water, but the water's not supposed to get in the boat. But as the water goes up and down, the water becomes tempestuous. If you're in the boat, you're going to feel it. You're going to deal with it. We're supposed to be like a boat in the world. A boat in the water. Don't let the water in the boat. That's bad. But don't take the boat out of the water. The boat belongs in the water. And then lastly, Jesus became profane in order to bring people together. We are supposed to be demonstrably different, but we're supposed to be demonstrably different in a way and with the intent of bringing people in. Now, very few of us face the dilemma or the distance of having to eat with Jews or Gentiles. We generally don't have that today. Okay? But you're at home, the doorbell rings. There's a person on the front step. They're wearing a MAGA hat, and they want you to sign a petition for the Texas Republican Party. You can invite them in. You can have a meal with them. Or maybe they've got a T-shirt on that says Black Lives Matter, And they're signing a petition for defund the police. Are you going to invite them in? Are you going to want to get to know who they are, why they believe what they do, what life circumstances have left where they are? Are you going to create an environment in such a way that the gospel presentation seems normal and not just a hunt for a scalp? Are we going to overcome those barriers that divide us? Or are we going to walk on the other side of the street when we see those people? That's what God is calling us to. When Jesus came into the world, he ate with sinners. He was surrounded by the unclean. He was surrounded by the unholy. And he deliberately went to them because it didn't make him unclean. He didn't have to be afraid. But his presence sanctified them. His presence set them apart. And many people believed because Jesus did things he wasn't supposed to do, went places he wasn't supposed to go to, and associated with people that Leviticus 11 and 12 said definitely don't do. Sin is still sin, but so much of what separates us isn't sin. Let's close with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we do thank you for your word. We thank you for Leviticus. We thank you that you have taught us who you are through object lessons. You have taught us through who you are in ways that we can understand. So Lord, I pray that we would be you. I pray that we would still see sin as sin and ask you to help us avoid it. Lord, I pray that we would see that which separates us and breaks, and that we would break those down. And Lord, I specifically thank you that you have eliminated the unclean food laws so that we can go out and have shrimp, lobster, and bacon cheeseburgers. Amen.